So can you start telling me a little bit about yourself, where your name and where you live and work?
Sure. My name is McQuaid and I live in Melbourne in Australia.
Right. And what do you do?
I work for PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I'm an executive director in the human capital team, and I also freelance working with organisations to bring out the best in their people.
Right. And what's your background for doing that?
Back in 2008-2009 I completed the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania with Martin Seligman, and following on from that really moved increasingly into the space around coaching and developing people to be their best.
Right. And so positive psychology, that was 2008, 2009, and coaching, when did you start?
Coaching, I did a coaching certificate back in 2007. It was by distance though, and I really felt like while it gave me some of the basics, it didn't give me enough grounding, and it really wasn't until I did the Masters in Positive Psychology that I felt confident enough that I had enough tools and knowledge to be able to do it in a way that felt authentic for me.
Right. And so what are some of the things that you're doing?
So at PwC, a big part of my job is designing learning and development curriculum using the principles of positive psychology to teach our 6,500 people in Australia the benefits of things like positive emotions and mindsets and neuroplasticity and the like. And as part of that, I do a lot of breakout coaching, both with teams and individuals, around their strengths and how they apply them into their jobs. How do they do some job crafting if they're not in a role that they feel that's bringing out the best in them? And then often along the way I complement it with other tools in positive psychology, again like the mindsets, like disputation techniques for underlying beliefs and things like that. And I also do a lot of that work freelance as well, so working again with either individuals or an organisational team. A lot of my stuff is based around the values and action strengths, and I use a lot of appreciative inquiry as the change and coaching technique for people.
Right. And the people that would normally, that you would do one-on-one coaching with, like what issues or challenges would they bring up?
Yeah, it varies. Some of them are executives that are trying to get to sort of the final level of their career and they may be stumbling. So in PwC, for example, to become a partner, which is our highest level in the firm, they have to go through quite an intense interview process, and that often triggers off their underlying beliefs about themselves and their nerves. And so in a couple of cases I've had people to coach who have failed at that final hurdle and are going to take another run at it, and so I coach them in preparation for that and sort of how to get out of their own way really, and be their best in that interview situation. Others, more junior members of staff who maybe are not doing so well at the moment in their job or feeling a bit stuck, or again wanting to get promoted, and again often helping them recognise their strengths, explore where they're best in their jobs, help them to craft more moments in their days where they can be at their best. Right down to graduates who we have coming out of uni and just entering the firm and starting their career and not really understanding what their job is all about. And again, helping them to understand not just the what of what they do in their job, so they come in with plenty of technical skills, but they're often lacking some of the how, about how do they do it in a way that's authentic and intrinsically rewarding for them so that they can stick the distance of it.
Right.
And then outside of that, more individuals, it might be people who are at a difficult stage of life and wanting to make a change, or have encountered a boss who they find very challenging, and they're trying to find ways to manage through that.
Right. And what would a coaching engagement look like?
Yeah, again, it varies. Most of mine tend to be more informal, so the ones in the workplace, it's often seeing somebody for 3 or 4 sessions where we're working through that specific situation where they're trying to get promoted, identifying their strengths in the first instance, and then really following. I use the Appreciative Inquiry 4D cycle a lot in my coaching model. I find that works well for me, and certainly seems to work very well for the clients that I have. So normally we'll start in that discovery stage, so we'll identify their strengths using the survey tool, talk about when are they at their best in their job, why is that. Then we'll normally do the dream step forward, and I get them to kind of go away for homework and imagine what that future could look like, using something like the best reflected self exercise, or otherwise some people who are more visual have put together, you know, a vision board or a scrapbook or something that sort of brings that to life for them. The next session they bring that back and we talk through what was in there and why was that meaningful and important, and how were their strengths being used in that vision, so that they have that sort of positive image pulling them forward into the future. And then we normally start to talk about, well, how they're going to get from where they are to that kind of outcome. And it's that stage normally I often will pick into some other positive psych interventions depending on what's coming up for that person. So sometimes it might be a belief and a story that they're telling themselves that particularly stands in their way, particularly in that cycle of promotion, often is where the not good enough story starts to really come up for people and starts to get in their way. And so we'll use kind of the ABCDE tools to really kind of pull that apart and dispute it and find the evidence of where it's not. And I get them to go back out and sort of practice it, finding where that story is coming up and can they dispute it. And so we do a bit of that for a session if that's where we need to go. Some of it in that getting from here to there is simply that they've been quite worn down maybe by a bad situation, and they just don't have enough positive emotion in their life to kind of propel them forward into anything. And so there I might use Barb Fredrickson's positivity ratio tools and try and find some really simple things that person might start to sprinkle into their days to just try and raise their positivity up a bit, maybe before we tackle the getting from here to there. What other ones have we used? The mindset stuff of Carol Dweck's quite a bit. So again, often in that here to there, you start to strike the fixed mindsets of I can't really change this, you know, it won't really matter what I do, it'll still be the same. And so often then we start to explore that Carol Dweck work and try to find more growth mindsets and practice that again during their time away from me, so that they can sort of share how they're finding that application. So the here to there stage of the appreciative inquiry process is sometimes it's really straightforward and there's a clear, you know, some small goals that we can set that they can start chasing after. And in other cases, that's often where it comes up that there's maybe a bit more work to do in other areas first before they're ready to go after that. When they are ready, we try and set sort of small, manageable goals where they can see progress quite quickly and sort of celebrate that progress as they're making it, so that they feel they maintain that motivation to keep stepping forward. And as part of that, in that kind of destiny step of the appreciative inquiry, it's the one small thing, and I often use the 5%. You know, if it was 5% better, what would it look like, so that they become more manageable changes, and where I can with that help them to create little habits that might help to pull them forward more consistently, rather than just a one-off step that's in the next thing and the next thing. And so within that habit bit, again, we often, you know, explore a bit of the self-regulation kind of Roy Baumeister work about how do you build that up like a muscle, but also using some of the goal setting pieces around the when-then programming. So, you know, when I am in a meeting with my boss, then I will speak up about what it is I need. Or if they're trying to create a habit, how do they sort of lower the amount of effort that's required to start practicing that? So if they're trying to create a study habit, maybe to get a qualification to move them on, how do they make sure they're getting that bit of study every day going, rather than becoming overwhelmed by the size of the task in front of them?
Right. So the AI model is spread over?
Generally, so it does vary. If I do a group, sometimes in PwC, because every staff member is meant to have a coach within the business, sometimes the coaches will ask me to come in and run a 90-minute to 2-hour workshop using the AI process and strengths as an introduction. And then the coaches will go off and sort of do the deeper work behind it one-on-one with their team members. And that, you know, it gets them off to the good start. So normally in that we'll use the VIA, they'll have done the VIA before they come into the 2-hour session. And then I'll use the AI model sort of through that session for them to explore their strengths in the past, what their achievements could look like in the year ahead for the dream bit, how would they get from here to there. They had 3 wishes that they could make for support from PwC to get from where they are to where they want to go. What would that look like? and if there was one thing they were going to start working on with their coach now, what would that be?
Yeah.
And then the coach will normally take that out into their ongoing coaching sessions and work with them.
Yeah.
When I've had clients that I'm seeing more specifically one-on-one, generally I spread that over 4 to 6 sessions,
right.
depending on how much we end up doing in that third D, in the sort of side steps that we're taking along the way.
Right. And you said something about in between the sessions people would have homework.
Yeah, so I'm a big one on the skin in the game. So if I do it over the sort of 6 sessions, then normally before they come I ask them to do their VIA strengths.
Yeah.
And our first session will spend sort of exploring that and finding the stories of when they've been at their best. And at the end of that first session I ask them to go away and give them the homework about dreaming forward.
Yeah.
And ask them to go and sort of, you know, be it in writing, be it visually, you know, whatever's going to resonate most with them, to create that vision and bring it back and tell me the story in the next session.
Yeah.
So in that next session we'd explore through what they created and why it was important, what sort of energised and excited them most about that. And then we'd start to talk about, well, how will they get from here to there.
Yeah.
And so I normally ask them to go away and reflect as homework out of that second session about if there were 3 wishes in order to get from here to there, what would those wishes be? And normally when they come back after that session is when you'll either have some really clear wishes that can start to be worked into goals, or you'll start to find they couldn't do it because they don't feel they've got the capacity to do it, or they're feeling quite helpless in their situation and they need some assistance working through that. Yeah. Or they don't know sort of where to direct their energy sometimes. So often that third session, rather than progressing straight on into goals, is working through the roadblocks about what was hard about it. And I find that really interesting. People I've found, clients I've had who find the dreaming bit really easy and right into it. I think this is going to be great. They're going to be able to, you know, really sail through this process. And then they come back at the design stage and like, I couldn't do it. You know, I couldn't work out what to wish for. I had too many things, or it wouldn't matter anyway, yeah. Or I just didn't know where to start. And then other clients who really struggled sometimes around the dream and have come back at that second session and gone, well, I didn't know what to dream for. I couldn't find it. And then when they've got their dream, suddenly sail through the design stage. So I find it really curious because, I find people are very interesting as to where their block actually comes in the process. So often in that design stage, I've learnt to leave space around those sessions rather than assume we're going to be able to, in that session, start to set a goal that they can work towards. Yeah. And to be flexible at that stage to see where their roadblocks are and what else I might have in the sort of positive psychology toolkit bag that might help them. And so depending on where they're at, that homework from that session and the next one might be more, you know, a side detour, if you like, using some of the other tools that we mentioned, like the positivity ratio work or the mindsets work or the ABCDE kind of work. Right. But the goal really in that design stage when they're ready is to set what's the small manageable goals that you're going to go after, who's going to support you in that, you know, what help are you going to need from people around you or from work or that to get that done, how are you going to celebrate it, how are you going to track it so that you know that it's getting there. And so then normally their homework is to go off and get started on that and then come back and see how they're doing with it, what do we need to tweak. And a lot of that last bit is celebrating with them so that they can actually see how they've gone over those sessions and they can feel the progress they're making and reflect that back to them, because I think often we don't see the change that we're creating because it comes in such incremental steps. Yeah.
And this celebration, what would it be like?
Often it's things that they'll come back and say, well, I went and did this, or I had that conversation, or I've signed up for that course. And I think they're so focused on the task, we take for granted what a big step forward that was. So generally I find it's a reflection back for them of, wow, so you went and did that, you know, let's think back to where you were when you started this, and how does that fit in your dream? And, you know, so often we get the dream bits out again and go, can you see how you're making this possible? In an effort to build some of that self-efficacy, that they can make these changes and they have it within them to do it and stick at it, so that then they're confident to keep taking the next step forward and the next step after that. And generally after those 6 sessions, I'll say to them, you know, you've started and I'm here if you need it, and if you want to come back maybe in 2 months and we'll do another check-in, or if you find yourself getting stuck, then, you know, reach out and we'll find a time and come by and have a chat. But I generally try after that to sort of let them find their own wings and fly for a bit and see what happens. And in most cases, you know, around the 3-month mark, we might have another catch-up again. I generally find they're making great progress by then, and it'll be okay until they hit the next sort of major challenge in their life or their career, and then again they might want some help getting over that, but it doesn't need the same sort of regularity once they've sort of found their feet with it. Right.
And being stuck and roadblocks and stuff, can you say something about that?
Yeah, so one of my coachees who was a graduate, when she came to me, for her it was more finding what it was she wanted to do in her career. She'd been so focused on the task of the job, and I think once she finally got that and realised it wasn't necessarily what she thought it was going to be, and she didn't enjoy it, it was sort of how did you evolve that into some of her other interests. And so that was, we did that work about 2 years ago, and she's been flying along and kicking goals and doing great things. Lately she's, you know, probably again sort of flattened out in her career, and she's ready for the next challenge, but she doesn't know how to move from where she is to where she wants to go. So then, you know, rather, sometimes it's, you know, going back through the process again. So with her it's been connecting sort of back into that dream about, well, that's okay, the dream's evolved, what does it look like next? And how are you going to get from here to there? So it's needed less work, because she's got a good basis on which to already build. But I think, you know, we all come to those crossroads in life, or those blockages in life, where sometimes you just need somebody else to, you know, I guess give you the permission to think in a clearer space about what comes next. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And some of them, as I say, have been people who have gone for a promotion and failed. So they've had the basics before, it's all been going well, and then they've come up with something that's maybe just touched more deeply into fears or insecurities that they might have, and so it's surfaced them in a way that they haven't had to encounter before. Yeah.
It's just because the concept of roadblocks or being stuck, I've been interested in that for a few weeks here, because some coaching models don't have that. You know, they have goal setting and you know, solutions, so they're very fast, and they don't necessarily mention that you can actually like maybe the model doesn't work, or you have to do something extra.
Certainly I think through the process it's been really, everybody's always okay at Discover, talking about the best of where we've been. People love that, and I think it's a great first coaching session, because it makes someone feel quite comfortable when they probably come in feeling quite vulnerable. So that one's never a problem, but it's always interesting between dream and design, and generally occasionally you get people who will sail through those, but most people get stuck in one or the other, and it's normally because it's tapping into a fear that they have sitting inside them about either what the future does look like, and what they feel they deserve, or what they can achieve, or what they're entitled to if they get stuck in dream. Or otherwise it's the fear of, you know, I can't really do this, I'm feeling quite helpless and overwhelmed, and they're lacking that self-efficacy and that confidence to be able to actually act on anything, even though they might have a very clear hope about where they want to go. So I guess there it's the willpower and the way power, and trying to reconnect those two together. And I think sometimes when we've been in challenging situations, particularly at work, like being knocked back for a promotion or something like that, they get broken apart.
Well, how does the coaching engagement end?
So normally at the beginning for most of them, if I'm coaching one-on-one, I'll explain that it's generally a 6-week process, but we'll sort of see how it goes and feel our way through if something's changing. So as we come to that 5th or 6th session, again, depending how fast they've gone through those Ds, I'm pretty clear that this is our last session for the moment. Because I like them to go out and try and put it to the test rather than sort of be too dependent on coming back to me every week, and in that way I can kind of see how much they'll fly on their own or whether they are going to need quite a lot more coaching. So I like to be quite clear from the start that it's 5 or 6 sessions. At the end of it, I always make sure that's that celebration and recognition of how they've gone. And then I normally say, look, we'll check in about 3 months and see how you've done with it, and if you want to have a top up or you want to come back and talk more, we can do that. So I normally email or call as we come up to that 3-month mark if I haven't heard from them in between. Occasionally someone will contact me before then and say, oh look, I'm stuck with this, and I say, no worries, let's sit down and have a chat and see if we can figure out what's going on. But mostly, it'll go through to the 3 months fairly easily, and I guess I'm seeing mostly people in a work situation who are struggling with a job or wanting to get a promotion or wanting to change a job. So it normally has some quite clear change outcomes. And they're realising that, or they know they're not realising that pretty quickly.
Right. You mentioned assessments, the VIA. Can you say something more about how you debrief it? So people do it at home?
So I ask people to do it before they come. And I do say, look, this can, when you sit down and do it, you might just want to think about where you're doing it. Are you at home or at work? What kind of frame of mind are you in? Because I do know that sometimes that can shift some of their strengths. So I suggest if they're particularly interested in their strengths at work, it's good to almost do it at work or at least in a bit of a work frame of mind, so you're seeing how the strengths will come up. And then when they come into the session, I ask them to bring their printout of their results. And we have a look through that, and I ask them, did it feel like them? Were there things in there that surprised them? Did they think this is what other people would reflect on their strengths? How do they feel those strengths are serving them in their job? Like, is it a good match to their job currently? Are there strengths that they'd like to have higher up in order to be able to do their job better? Do those strengths ever get them in trouble? So we often explore a bit of the shadow sides of the strengths in case maybe there's something that's being overplayed there. I try, and how do they work together? Are the strengths clustering together in particular ways for them? Do they see sort of synergies? And once we've had sort of a very general chat, I find those questions, I also generally like to complement it alongside some of the knowledge of the VIA about, these strengths are buildable and changeable, and they do tend to cluster together, they do have a shadow side to them. So I find it's a good way to help inform them a bit about the tool and what they're seeing. And then I normally use the sort of discovery AI question about, can you think of some of your best moments at work where you've been really engaged and energised and performing really well? Which of these strengths, do you think were at play, and can you talk to me a little bit about it? And I find then in the stories that start to come up, it helps them to understand those strengths better and what they really mean and how they're actually using them day to day.
What about, do you use other assessments?
Again, it sort of depends what happens in those later sessions. I mentioned Barb Fredrickson's positivity ratio. So I've had people log online and do that sort of over 2 weeks to see where their ratio is at, and explore ways that they can start sort of, experimenting with some of those different positivity techniques to see if they make a difference for them. What other assessments? The growth mindset one, so Carol Dweck's sort of chart. If I suspect that they're showing a lot of fixed mindset, then generally I'll just introduce that as kind of the survey as a bit of a tool, just to test it, and then talk through maybe what it means and how they can experiment with it. I think if there are other ones that I've used in particular, they're probably the main ones. I don't tend to use like the satisfaction with life scale or things like that, again because most of my coaching is very specific to career.
Yeah.
So, you know, again, the outcomes for people normally are quite clear about, well, I want to enjoy my job again, or I want to get promoted, or I want to get a different job. So I tend to work more to those outcomes than satisfaction with life. And what's the other one? Sometimes I use the Job, Careers and Callings, one of Amy Ranuski's, which is more sort of, I guess, a conversational scale. But I find that quite helpful, particularly if someone's really not happy in their job, about, well, any job has a capacity to be one of these three things. So let's sort of see where you're at and what would it take to shift it.
Yeah. What about, you mentioned several positive interventions, and can you say something more? Like how to use them?
Yeah, so I draw a lot on, in the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology course, Karen Rydich had us for a coaching unit, and she gave us some great worksheets and tools out of that, which I found really helpful with clients. Say with the ABCDE, doing the disputation technique. If I'm finding someone's got quite a negative story that's particularly playing out around trying to set those goals and change anything, then what generally I've done is try to take it to the side. So rather than necessarily deal with that belief head on in the work situation, generally I'll say, well, you know, let's have a chat about how we create the stories that we're telling ourselves, and if this is serving us well, and if not, how might we start to challenge those stories and look for alternative explanations. And so then I'll generally ask them, you know, so what is a situation that's, you know, maybe really you've reacted in a way that was quite extreme, or you weren't that happy with later, you know, what was going on for you. So try and take it outside of work first. I generally find it's a bit less confronting for them, and those situations aren't always as raw as the work one is at that moment in time. And actually use Karen's worksheet around, you know, identifying, well, what was the adversity, what were the consequences, therefore what were the connections to potential beliefs, does that feel like it matches or not, what might be some of the thinking traps that were coming into play, could there be alternative explanations, if those explanations were potentially true, how would you now feel about the situation and what would you do differently. So try to teach them the skill almost outside of the work situation that's causing the coaching requirement. And then ask them to practice then taking that skill into the work situation, and then to go away and maybe practice it with things that are coming up at work during the week, and then debrief it in our next session about, well, how did you find it? Were you able to use it in situations? And just again sort of explore if they're stuck anywhere with it, how can we practice it maybe in a different setting.
So you practice in the coaching session?
Yeah, practice in the coaching session, but with a situation not specific to the work one first, to teach the skill. And then I ask them to take that and use it in the work situation during the time between coaching sessions, and come back and debrief how they've gone, and fine-tune anything that might be going wrong, or celebrate, you know, if it's been of any use for them. So that's one. The positive emotion one, if I get them to do Barb's positivity ratio test, and normally just sort of reflect on, is it, if it's less than the 3 to 1, which generally it is for them, you know, what could they do to either raise their positivity up or lower the negativity in their lives, or some of both. And generally, again, I often go back to that discover piece within the Appreciative Inquiry. You say, well, what are the things that bring you great joy or great inspiration or feelings of serenity? And, you know, is there a way to bring even 10 minutes of that into your day? Can we create a little kind of 10-minute jolt of joy that you can practice each morning, or you can turn to when things are feeling quite overwhelming and stressed? And is there a way to maybe reduce some of the negativity that's going on? You know, is there particular situations or people that are rubbing you really hard? Is there a way to maybe minimise some of that, or can we try to reframe some of it? You know, sort of what's happening there that might be creating some of that negativity. So again, you know, so normally in the coaching session we might agree a couple of things that they want to go out and try, and then they go out and practice them during that intervening time, and in the next session again we debrief. How did you go with them? Did it feel like it made any difference? You know, we'd look at the positivity ratio results again and see if anything's shifting there for them, and then keep tweaking it. You know, what's working, what's not, what you add in if there's not something that's doing what they want.
Right, right. And so, is it only with some interventions that you use them in the session and give them as homework, or some interventions you only use in sessions or only do as homework?
Generally, I try and share the knowledge and the skill if it's required in the session, and then set it as practice in the context as homework.
Right, right.
Even if it's, say, something around the boosting the positivity ratio, it might be, I don't know, watching a funny YouTube clip every day, or making sure you read something that you're really going to enjoy each day to, you know, spark your curiosity, or connecting with a friend to make sure you've got more social time. So in that case, we're not so much practicing the skill in the session, but I might talk about why that would be a helpful thing to do. So normally in that kind of situation, I might give them choices of, these are things that have been proven to help boost your positivity. Is there something in there that really kind of resonates and appeals for you? Okay, great. How will you make that happen outside of the session? So try and get them to do a bit of thinking through, how am I going to actually make this work? And then get them to go and do it and come back and say how they went with it.
Right.
It just varies. I think sometimes if there's a skill to be taught, I try to practice it with them if it's not a skill they've used before. Whereas if it's an experience to be had, then it's kind of, well, let's go out and have the experience, but let's make sure you're actually going to do it. Don't sit here and talk about it and then come back next time and go, oh, I forgot all about that one.
and how do you make sure that they do it?
Well, I try and help them build it into a habit. So I'm a big believer in little habits can make a big difference in lives. So let's say that they wanted to try and boost their positivity by re-engaging with their creativity. So they were going to try and, I don't know, paint as their kind of moment of joy for each day. So I for myself, I've found really useful over the times trying to create 10-minute habits because it's easy to go, I'm too busy, I've got too much on. It's pretty hard to argue about finding 10 minutes in a day to do something. So half an hour's like, oh, just, you know, time slipped away. But 10 minutes, you know, can be squeezed in all sorts of places. And then I try and help them break that 10 minutes down into, so how are you going to make the first 30 seconds of it really easy to get started? So if it was painting, it might be making sure when I walk in the door that my easel and brushes are right there. And so when I dump my bag, the next thing I'm going to pick up is the paintbrush. How do I spend like a good sort of 9.5 minutes in that, just enjoying it? And how do I make sure I recognise and celebrate at the end of it that I did it, so that I get that dopamine hit that's going to help consolidate neurologically that behaviour for me. And the celebration might be ticking it off the list. I'm quite an anal person, so I like to tick it off the list or cross it off. It could be texting a friend and saying, have it completed today. You know, it could be a little victory dance for yourself around the lounge room. Whatever it is that appeals to your sense of motivation, but it's that recognition that actually, it was just 10 minutes, but in those 10 minutes you moved yourself closer towards the life you want to have, and it only takes, you know, an accumulation of those 10 minutes over time to start being more in the place that you want to be. So I try and help them think through. They say, I'm going to put more positivity in my day by making sure I paint once a day. So, well, how are you going to make sure that happens? Is it scheduling at a time, so it's first thing in the morning before the rest of the day gets away? Is it programming this kind of when-then prompts? Is it thinking through how that 10 minutes is going to flow so that they're more likely to go and do it rather than be unprepared, tired at the end of the day when they think about it finally, and then madly scrambling the next time before they see me to get it done.
And when do you know which intervention to use, or how do you know?
Normally, I guess being trained in Appreciative Inquiry and the social construction kind of school of life, for me it's listening to the stories. It's listening to what they're telling me. it's listening to what they're telling me is holding them back. And I look for the roadblocks, I guess, which is maybe funny for somebody trained in positive psychology. I look for where the hesitations are, because I think when we feel confident and capable, we move through those steps quite smoothly, and it's been maybe more just creating the space to have the permission to think about it. But most people I've coached, I find, have a hesitation somewhere along that process, as I said, normally between dream and design somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think when there's a hesitation there, there's something sitting behind that that's causing it. So I try and look for what the hesitations are and what I might have in my positive psychology tool bag that goes to that. So is it a story that's getting in the way of them? Then I normally go to the disputation techniques, because it's often that underlying beliefs that are kind of in the way. Is it that lack of kind of energy and helplessness? Often then I'll try the positivity ratio pieces. Again, sometimes the story is more about I can't, I don't have the capability, in which case I look a bit more, is that fixed mindset coming up?
Yeah.
And that's where I find the tools quite helpful, the assessment tools, because if I think it's the positive emotion, positivity ratio, but their ratio comes back, it looks pretty healthy, then I go, okay, well, why don't we have let's have a think about mindsets and see how that goes. So I think normally I'll have a hunch based on the story I'm hearing, but then I test that hunch with the tools before I go forward. In most cases, my hunch has been right. But it's nice to have that confirmation.
But so do you have several tools?
Well, so use the tools. So generally the things I find coming up most is it's that the positivity ratio is quite low, so they're almost in that sort of depressed flat state, and they just don't have the energy to create the dream, or they don't have the energy to imagine what the pathway would be. Otherwise, I find that there's a story that's been replaying through most of their lives that comes to some of those underlying beliefs in the disputation stuff. Or I find that it's more fixed mindset and they're actually resisting the learning opportunity because they're scared of failure. And then so they're the ones I work with the most. It might be the type of people I coach, because I'm coaching very, PwC is generally very analytically minded, left-brained people. So that they tend to be the ones coming up a lot. It's not to say that they would be the only ones, but they'd be the most common, consistent ones that I see.
Right. I have a few questions about knowledge sharing. So do you share your knowledge when you work with people? Yeah, I do, because I'm high in curiosity. And I find the knowledge so interesting. It's actually been a challenge for me, learning what's the right amount of knowledge to share. And again, I often come back to the strengths of the person. So if I know I've got someone who's actually quite high in love of learning or curiosity or that, then I know that it's important to share the knowledge for those people, because they want that rationale. If I've got people who are, say, higher in strengths like humour and playfulness or kindness, I know that they're less likely to want lots of the science behind it all. So, often finding those first sessions, particularly when we're doing the VIA, is a great way to try and gauge how much knowledge are they wanting out of the coaching process, and how much are they just wanting tools and ideas to go and work with. But it could again just be my curiosity bias. I feel responsible that that's part of what I should be sharing with them, so they understand the method behind the choices that are being made, so that in future they can use those methods again in those situations. So can you say the method behind which choices? Yeah, so I guess the science behind the choices. So when they're doing something like VIA and they've got that tool, I think it's important that they understand these are their intrinsic motivators. And they are changeable and buildable, and they will change during their lives, and so it's good to redo it, at regular intervals or particular moments of change in life, that they do have shadow sides, that when we're in that state of flow, we get all sorts of good benefits in our lives. So I like to feel that I've shared why this is a useful tool for them, so that then later on, they're at a different stage of their life,
they know that, okay, I remember that tool was a good way to understand some of my intrinsic motivations and my values. Maybe I need to go and check it again because maybe things have changed around, and maybe they're not the same strengths anymore and I need to tap something different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does.
So a bit the same, I normally explain that I'm using Appreciative Inquiry through the coaching process, and I explain at the start, this is sort of the 4 Ds, or the process we're going to work through, and this is why it's important to discover the best of our past and why positive images pull us forward, and why we need pathways to move from here to there, and talk a little bit about some of the hope theory work there on willpower and way power, and why we need to measure and be accountable for the changes that we're going to make. When I talk about positivity ratio, I talk a bit about Barb's, studies on the tipping point of 3 to 1, and why that matters and how it builds and how it broadens us and why those are beneficial for them.
Yeah.
So I do, at times, as I say, if I've got someone I know who's very strong in curiosity and love and learning, I can go lots more into that and have my own sort of fun. But I know that someone who's not as high in some of those things, I'll dial it back, so I'm maybe not talking about as many studies or things like that, but I still like them to understand the benefit of the tools they're getting, so that in future, again, if they're up against a challenge, they know that maybe that's a tool they can go and tap.
Right. I have a question about flexibility, like adapting to the clients and their context.
Yeah.
Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I guess one of the reasons I like the Appreciative Inquiry model is I find that it allows people to discover their own stories within it. So while it does guide them through a process through those each of those 4 Ds, where they go with it and how they shape it is very much up to the stories that they choose to build. So when they think about their best experience of their strengths, I'm not prompting that into certain directions. It's a very broad, general question, and the stories that they tell me tells me something about what's important to them by the things that they focus on. And the same when you give them the opportunity to create their dream of what would the future look like, whatever they bring back is very much theirs rather than influenced by ideas that I might have implanted about what a good future looks like or a good life looks like. And a bit the same, I like it around the, if you had 3 wishes, what would you wish for? Because it's so broad, it's genuinely their wishes rather than things I think they should maybe be doing.
Yeah.
So I like that, and that's why I think that social constructionism view within coaching has a lot of power, because rather than unintentionally directing it with my own biases, or my own knowledge of the world or how you bring about success or my own experiences, it's very much calling on them to create the content of their session. So I find that helps a lot with flexibility. And again, I think it was that challenge initially when I started using the process. I was like, oh, well, each week we'll just do a different D and we'll kind of, it'll be smooth sailing and we'll come out the other end and it'll all be fantastic. And it's been learning to have that flexibility that often along the way, most people get a little stuck somewhere with it. And so when they're stuck, having that confidence to just pause with the process and explore why are we stuck there and what will it take to unstick it before we kind of keep progressing forward.
Right.
So they've probably been my 2 biggest, but I do, as I say, I like that social constructionism piece for the reason that I think it removes a lot of my bias from it and it allows them to tell their stories unedited, if you like.
And just to make sure I understand, so it removes your bias, is that because of the openness of the questions or?
Because the questions are so broad, like, so tell me about a time you've been most engaged and energised at work, rather than, tell me about a time when you were promoted really quickly. Or tell me about a time when someone really recognised your efforts. So rather than adding my kind of lens of what being good at your job might encompass, that, where are you engaged and energised, I think is free of my bias about what success in a job looks like. And it allows me to understand what is important to them more easily. Does that make sense? Whereas I think sometimes I've seen, and I haven't used them myself in coaching, but I've had other people use them with me or in groups that I've been in that are more, you know, I guess asking for when you're at work, where are you most successful? When you're at work, you know, where are you getting promoted? You know, where are you being recognised? Where are you getting pay rises? And all those things. And they're all important. They're all part of doing a good job. But for some people, they're more important than others.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think rather than bringing my lens of what being good at your job looks like, that beauty of the appreciative inquiry approach is it leaves it very broad for them to tell you what matters to them in their job.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And what do they tell you? What's no, and I have another question. Their expectations when they come could influence the outcome probably. There's some research seems to suggest that. Do you do something to work with their expectations?
I don't. I guess I try to set expectations, one, by defining the process that we're going to go through. So I try to give them a clear roadmap so they feel like they can relax a little bit and trust the process, God forbid, by helping outline where that process is taking them. And then I do try to talk about, in terms of their expectations, what is it they're hoping will change, what is it that they're particularly wanting to work on, so that I understand what success feels like for them. But I also, I guess, ask them to, while keeping that focus, be open to other things that might come out along the way. Because sometimes I think some clients I've seen are very focused on getting that promotion, for example, and yet they're not sure, they haven't necessarily thought a lot about why they want that promotion. So sometimes, particularly in a place like PricewaterhouseCoopers, where they're very programmed to climb the ladder, get to the top, get the next promotion, the next promotion, the next promotion, particularly at that point where you go from director to the final promotion level of partner. Sometimes they've climbed their whole life to that point without necessarily wondering what they were after.
Right.
And often at that stage, they're in that sort of 30 to 35 year age where they're starting to maybe think a bit more about life balance and what the rest of their life comprises. And they've often either just started to get young families, or I found a few at that age going through their first divorce. And so I guess in being focused on getting the outcome they want, which is the promotion, which is absolutely fine, I do also often ask them to just make space, particularly as they do the dream exercise, that it may take them to places they didn't expect to go, and not to hold that back. That it's okay, their dream looks quite different from what they thought it would at the beginning of the process, that's all right, and let's kind of explore that and see what that means for the end goal.
Right. What about your relationship with the people that you're working with? Do you do something to maintain it, or establish it and then maintain it?
Yeah, it's been varied. So some of them are people who have had some form of reporting line into me. So I'm in a coach role as one of their mentors or their bosses. So they're generally, we've had a relationship that's ongoing outside of the coaching structure. And it's funny, those relationships, even when I've no longer been a boss or mentor, have continued. Right. So, I still, there are probably, a good handful of people that I would still see every couple of months for a coffee or a catch-up who have been previous coachees in that work situation. Who want to touch base for advice or ideas or just to catch up. So that's been interesting. And then there are others where it's very specifically focused around the coaching. And because particularly at PricewaterhouseCoopers, I might run into them in other meetings or settings as time goes by. So it's always nice to see them and how are they doing, but we haven't intentionally maintained that formality. It tends to be more I have the ongoing relationship where I've had some other form of relationship other than just coach with those people. Right.
And do you do something in a session to create trust and empathy?
Well, I find that's, again, for me, that's the beauty of the appreciative inquiry process, because it starts at that discover stage where you're asking somebody you're allowing somebody to show them the best of themselves. It builds trust straight away because they feel confident and comfortable and safe when they're able to tell that story and show that side of themselves. Also, of course, that kind of session induces quite a strong positive energy in that person, and that they've shared that experience with you, so it starts to feel good when they're with you. So I think it creates a connection right from that very first session of safety and trust, but also, I guess, I want to say good feeling, that's very technical, it's not at all. There's just a warm rapport because they're talking about good things in their life and they're feeling good about themselves, and particularly when they come into the coaching, that's often not what they were feeling before they walked into the room. They're normally coming because there is a specific thing that they want to work on that's, maybe getting them down or feeling like they're holding them back, and they walk into the coaching, they're feeling a bit vulnerable and nervous about what to expect. And then they get to talk about, stories of when they were at their best, and that positivity starts to flow through them, and all those good chemicals happen in their head, and you're able to connect with that, and the mirror neurons are kind of firing between the two of you. It creates quite a strong rapport very quickly. And I find that holds in good stead then. When you go into the dream stuff, it's a much quieter space. So that second session is often, it's, more quiet and graceful and hopeful. There's something quieter about those hopes than that energy of reflecting and savouring, the best of the past. There's a certain fragileness about, well, this is my hope for the future, this is what it could look like. For some that's still very energising and exciting, but I often find that that's a quieter session, but because we've had that shared positive emotion experience in the first session, it creates that space to be able to share those hopes together. And then when the rubber kind of hits the road in that design stage, and they've got to start making some effort and do more of the work, and the not as fun stuff, again, by then there's that sense of rapport of, well, I've seen the best in you, and I understand your hopes for the future and how you hold those, so now let's work together on making them happen. So even in large groups, and I've done Appreciative Inquiry summits now with 500 people in a room, I'm always, every time, amazed at the energy and the emotional journey that process creates in people, collectively or individually. It's an incredibly powerful tool.
And do you do something to help the clients stay engaged in the process, the coachees to stay engaged in the process of working towards their goals?
Well, mostly I find the follow-up sessions work quite well for that, because they feel like they've got to come back and tell me what they've done. So I think the coaching sessions in themselves bring a level of accountability for them to feel like, oh God, I've got to go back and show Michelle something or tell her something, so I better get on with it. But I try again to encourage them to be self-monitoring. So we were talking before about the habits and sort of, how do you celebrate the habit? Is it ticking it off the list? Is it, crossing it off? Is it telling a friend? Have you kind of got a habit buddy that you're working with on it? Or is it the dance around the lounge room? But I try to encourage them, particularly as we get into that design and destiny stage, to create their own ways that they're going to monitor and be accountable and celebrate their progress, so that when the coaching stops and I'm suddenly not there, that they've got to come and report to, that they've got a way to sustain it without me.
Right. And do you have some examples of what people have come up with?
Yeah, again, it's often the most basic things. Like, it sounds really ridiculous about ticking something off a list or crossing it off, but amazingly for most people that provides an incredible sense of satisfaction. Personally, I like it better if they've kind of got a buddy, a habit buddy or a goal buddy, somebody that they're going to be sharing it with. Because I think it takes the accountability they're feeling in the coach-coachee relationship into a more social relationship with someone who's ongoing in their lives. And I think that social support is so important, and again, that person can kind of give you a bit of a prod when you need it, whereas ticking it off a list, although you see the blank page every time you look at it, maybe doesn't prod you in quite the same way. So I think it's how do you build that accountability into their lives when the coaching is done is a really important part of it.
Right. And what's their feedback to you about what works best for them?
In terms of the accountability?
No, in general.
In general? Again, I think generally I find people are amazed how well that appreciative inquiry process works, because when you explain it at the start, it sounds too simple.
Yeah.
and it's really interesting in workshops with large groups of business people when you say, we're going to work through your strengths and how do you use them in your job, and then you're going to work on this with your coaches afterwards. They're sure that there must be more to it than those 4 steps. And so that's generally what I find at the end of it, is they're surprised how 4 very simple steps can take you so far. Because that seems, it's not that it seems too easy, because actually when you're in those steps, there's a lot of work going on and a lot of effort that's required, and they know that because they're making it. But it actually feels pretty straightforward when you walk through it. And again, I like that because it gives them the skill to repeat it with or without me later in their lives when they're faced with challenges. So that's probably the biggest one. I think the other one is they're often surprised if you use the positivity ratio work or the disputation techniques or the mindsets. They're surprised how just having that level of awareness to those things in their lives can suddenly create a space to make shifts that felt quite difficult beforehand. And I think, most of them, very few of them really understood their strengths before they came in. So they might have said, I'm good at accounting, or I'm good at numbers or maths or something, but they never thought about how they were good in the world and what they brought to it. And so I think that sense of self and about what they're proud about in themselves and they value in themselves. Normally by the end of it, I find they're talking. I don't have to prompt them anymore about which strength and how you're using it or that. They're coming in and saying, I used my strength of courage today, and this is what I did. And they're excited about that, and so they should be, and I think that's an amazing achievement as well.
And the progression, can you say something about how you notice that they're progressing? Yeah,
again, and sorry to keep coming back to the framework, but it gives me a really good sense of progress, because when I ask them to come back with their dream, I can see really quickly whether they've got a dream or not, or whether they've gotten stuck. The same when we ask to say, what are the 3 wishes, you can see pretty quickly, have they got them? Are they wishes that are really going to get them there, or was this a half-assed attempt because they had to come up with something? So again, because the appreciative inquiry process itself is quite well defined, it provides pretty clear milestones along it to see, are they progressing and are they ready to take it to the next step, the next D in that process, or actually have we hit the roadblock? Or have we, are we kind of stalled? And what do we need to do to unstick that? And that's where, it became really clear. Although I thought when I started everybody kind of sailed through that process, it became really clear where people were getting stuck with the dream or the design and then needing to pause and try and find out what else was going on.
Right.
And I think, for some of that, particularly in the design stage, sometimes that's the peeling back the layers. So, we might go to work on something like the positivity ratio and it helps bump them forward a bit, but there's probably more, it helps bump them forward enough for them to be able to move forward in this cycle and sort of see what happens next. But there's probably more layers of work there to be done in ongoing cycles. But, it's sort of, I guess the times I've been really challenged in it is when somebody gets stuck at that stage, how many layers do you peel back? Because there are some that you could be coaching for the next 2 years and not have gotten through all the layers. So my tendency's been more to try and peel back at least one layer, that they can move forward a bit with the first goal and see how that goes. Rather than just get stuck there trying to peel all the layers back before you move them forward. I'm a big believer in building self-efficacy in people, and so a big part of my goal in the coaching is how can I give you enough self-efficacy to take some steps forward. And
Yeah.
even if they're only little steps, they're only the 5% steps, then, you know, that's some progress, and let's start on that, and we can build more on there if that's what we need to do.
Yeah. And can you say something about mechanisms or causes of the change that you are seeing?
Yeah, in the discovery stage, I do think that's about self-belief. I think that's about remembering that there have been times in your job where you were really engaged and you were really enjoying it and something really good was happening. Even if that's a small moment for you. You know, for some people, they've got rich pickings when it comes to choosing those stories. For others, particularly, say, graduates, just because they haven't worked for very long often, they're much smaller moments. But each person that finds that moment, and they all do, that everybody finds a moment that's been good somewhere in their work, even if it was only for half a day. There's a sense of confidence that comes out of that I can have that again.
Yeah.
There's something, I have some basic essentials in me that made that moment happen, and I can create more of them.
Yeah.
So for me, I think a big mechanism in it, again, is that self-belief, self-efficacy, that they have the ability to create the kind of outcome that they're hoping for. I think there's the second piece around the dream is really igniting that sense of hope. Particularly in the workplace, where we often find people are feeling quite helpless because it's, you know, a boss that's doing something to them, or it's the system doesn't allow them to get ahead, or, you know, there's not the opportunities, you know, the economy's bad, and so there's not the... So there's this real sense I often find in the people I see of helplessness and feeling disempowered, and that dream stage really lets them connect with feeling hopeful again. And even if it's just a really small, shiny, you know, shimmer of hope, even that glint of hope is enough to then make them feel like, okay, there's something that's worth fighting for in this, or there's something that's worth working towards in this. And again, I think that's really important before trying to set the goals. Because otherwise those stories keep playing out. So I often talk to them about, you know, can we put aside being the victim? Can we put the villains to one side? Can we put the helplessness aside? And if you were going to be a hero in this, what would you start doing differently? And I find that changing of the narrative can really be done quite nicely in the AI process. In the design stage, again, I tend to use the hope stuff around willpower and way power. So how we're going to use those via strengths to get the willpower, those intrinsic motivators really connected in, but also how we're going to plan out some small concrete goals to get that way power happening, and how do you anchor that, as we talked about, to some of the habits, the self-regulation mechanisms, so that it's sustainable, but also how do you link it to some of the neurobiological bits about what's happening in their heads around building the neural pathways to make it repeatable, and getting the kind of dopamine cascade to consolidate that and to create that habit of reward from those kind of behaviours. So for me, there's a couple. I think each of the Ds sort of brings out a different mechanism, and again, that's maybe why I like that framework so much, because I feel like it helps me move them through the process.
And what you do to develop as a professional?
Well, I'm doing my PhD at the moment, so that keeps me reading and researching quite rigorously. It was funny, when I finished my Masters of Applied Positive Psychology, I really grieved for not having the constant requirement to read and write, particularly the writing. Like, I think the reading was easy to keep doing, and I was still reading a lot of books and articles in this kind of field, but without the writing or having to argue about it in class, I was missing the putting that knowledge regularly together into a way that I could practically use it and bring it into my coaching. So I started a blog a couple of years ago called 3 Things I Learnt This Week, mostly for myself, and I shared it with a couple of friends who I knew were sort of interested in that space. And so each week I try sort of within a paragraph to highlight one thing I learnt and the question that it prompted for me about bringing out the best in people, particularly in workplaces. And it's been funny over time, the people following that blog has grown and grown and grown. And last year someone said, oh, can you put that into an ebook, because I've got this folder of all your blogs of every week, and we use them in our team meeting each week. And I was like, okay. So I'm finishing the ebook at the moment, but that's been a great mechanism for me to keep, one, looking for new information that I can put in there, but two, then challenge myself about what's most interesting in that and why is it interesting when it comes to bringing out the best in people at work. I try and attend conferences, but I do try and be a bit selective about it, just because otherwise you could go all year long and never get any work done. And I try and speak pretty regularly at conferences now as well, so that it challenges me to put a presentation together of my ideas, again, so that I can argue it. So there's such rich pickings between, TED videos that are out there, the number of conferences, great journals, constant flow of amazing books. It's almost impossible to keep up with. So I have a habit of every day I try and read for at least 10 minutes 3 times a day. So I try and do one in the morning when I get up. I normally do one around lunchtime and one in the evening before bed. So there's about half an hour of reading every day, or watching an educational video or something like that, and I find that keeps me topped up.
Right. And when you learn something new, how do you start using it? How do you integrate it?
Yeah, well, as I said, the blog's been a great one for me, because that created a weekly habit about how do you take this information and use it in a story. Some of it I write up on, I still write up like my notes from when I was in MAP. So can I summarise this? And then I'll often go back and use that when I'm looking for either workshop ideas, so where I've seen people facilitate or teach a concept in a great way that's inspired me. So it's almost like my toolbox for speaking ideas or teaching ideas. And as I say, pretty much once a week now I speak somewhere or facilitate something for a group, and so I find that that's a great way to make me keep refreshing my content and teaching it out. They're probably the main ones. I think the thing I've missed most since the master's course is having that cohort of people to share ideas with. And test your thinking with and bounce it off. So I'm lucky my PhD, I'm doing a partnership with somebody, so now we have a call every week where we get to bounce ideas off each other, and that's been a real godsend to have sort of back in my life. And then I've managed to create a few professional relationships with people in similar fields here in Melbourne, and probably, mostly when we catch up at conferences or other things, but we can get together and sort of share, what are you teaching at the moment, what am I teaching, what have you seen that's really working, and that's been great as well. But it's taken time to find those people and build those relationships. Right.
And what would you say is special about positive psychology coaching, or is it not special? Is it the same as other ways of doing coaching?
I think the tools are a bit different. Some of the tools are the same. So sometimes if I've seen somebody that's not as work related, I'll use tools like the Wheel of Life to try and understand what is it they're most wanting to shift in their life or things like that. But I think it's some of the more specific positive psychology tools like Barb's positivity ratio or the Appreciative Inquiry framework. So I just think it's a broader set of tools that already builds on a lot of great coaching tools that are available, but maybe deepen the toolkit. And then for me personally, I guess I have a very high degree of confidence in those tools that I'm using because I understand the empirical research and evidence behind them. So I feel, whereas some of the coaching tools, I found it hard at times to find the evidence base, and it may be that I haven't looked in all the right spots, but I think it's a bit more mixed with some of the coaching ones that are there, that are how effective are those tools and in what situations. And again, more work can definitely be done on the pos psych side of that as well, but generally, particularly the ones I'm using, because I've studied in depth behind the evidence base for them, I feel confident that that they have an empirical basis that works.
Yeah. And are there things we've not talked about that are important to understand the way that you work?
For me, I have a real interest in neurobiology. So I'm very interested in what's happening inside somebody's head when I'm taking them through different interventions. and how am I tapping into the best parts of their brain in order to bring out the best of them. And I'll often share that as part of the knowledge sharing. I'll often explain to somebody, you know, this works because it has this chemical reaction inside your body. And again, I like that because for me it provides a certainty to, you know, as much as we understand on some of these in terms of what's actually going on for them. But I also feel like not only is it harnessing their psychology, but it's harnessing their neurobiology in order to help them get the outcome that they want.
Yeah.
So, you know, one of the big pieces that I work with, particularly with those kind of directors who've missed out on the partner interview, is often, and I use this quite a bit with the ABCDE technique, you know, between our mammal brain and our thinking brain, and what happens when those feelings of fear or trespass or the like get triggered up, and the mammal brain becomes so strong that it makes it difficult for the thinking brain to engage. And so how do you first calm that mammal brain down so that you can get to the disputation in the thinking brain? And again, maybe because I'm working with very analytically minded people, they kind of like that science is quite reassuring to them that it's not something that's wrong with them. They're having a really natural biological response to a stressful situation. And by understanding that and learning how to calm that down by using the disputation technique, for example, then they can get into the thinking brain where they need to be. So for me, I just because I have a huge personal interest in that field, I try to blend and challenge my understanding of how do those positive psychology interventions work neurobiologically, and you know that's still a growing field as well, so some of it is clearer than other pieces of it, but where I can, I like to understand that.
Right. And how is the group coaching different from individual coaching?
I think it's really different. Because in a group, and the groups I coach could be anything from 10 to 50 people in a room. And even though with 10 people in a room, each one's on such a different personal journey as to where they are. So again, I find the appreciative inquiry process good for a group because it allows every person's own story to be told. And normally I get them to be working in pairs as they're sharing their stories about their best experiences, their dreams, what are they going to do. But where it gets hard is where they get stuck. So it's much harder in a group to work out if one person gets stuck in the dream and actually their dream's a bit half-assed or they haven't been able to really do it. You can't stop everything for that person. You've got to sort of keep moving through for the group. So it's often finding where are people getting stuck and then just making sure there's some follow-up afterwards to say, I noticed you're kind of stuck there. You know, it might be worth with your coach or, separately with me outside of this session, if you want to have a chat about that, let's go explore that a little bit more. So the group, I follow the same process flow through, and I'm looking for where people get stuck. So if I've got a whole room stuck at dream, that's not a problem because we can stop there and play through a bit. But the same in design, whatever's stopping them is normally different for most of the participants. And you can't work through all of that in a room in that kind of session. So again, I try to highlight, particularly at PwC, where they each have their own coaches working with them afterwards to say, look, this is an area I think needs a bit more work and maybe you want to explore here a bit deeper. Right.
And do you have some advice for other people who would like to start combining positive psychology and coaching?
Most advice would just be do it. I think, again, and it's the way I talk about it when we teach at PwC, where, these are generally auditors or accountants whose identity is very tied to vigorously finding mistakes and vigorously pointing out what's wrong. That's their job and that's what they get promoted for, and their identity is very tied to a deficit mindset. So the way we've been able to introduce positive psychology successfully to those people is to say, those are all important tools and you don't want to lose those, that's important expertise to have. But do you want to broaden your toolkit? Because there'll be times when that serves you really well and times when it doesn't. And so, again, by helping them understand, maybe because they're analytically minded, we've had quite good success helping them understand a bit more of what's going on in the brain. So, you know, if I want to see someone at their best, if I want them to collaborate, if I want them to be a bit creative and innovative, to think outside the box a bit, then coming at what's wrong isn't going to get me to that kind of outcome. I need to come more at what's right and find ways to build on it. So we talk about it not as the either or, but the and. So there are times when it's really valid to fix a problem. And when that's what you need to do, then you need the tools to do that. And there are other times where it's really valid to build on a strength. And I think when it comes to building on strengths, the positive psychology interventions are, again, some of the best proven interventions that are out there.
Yeah. Other advice?
Other advice, besides play and enjoy it. Look, I think if you haven't explored Appreciative Inquiry, it is a model of change worth looking at. I find it powerful because it's strength-based change, and I find it powerful because it really taps into people's intrinsic motivations and their sense of narrative and story, rather than guiding them too far. So there's a wealth of materials out there on the internet. There's the Appreciative Inquiry Commons. You'll find lots of different tools up there, like coaching guides and things like that can be used. And I've certainly found it a very valuable tool.
Right. Just write this down.
There are a couple of specific Appreciative Inquiry coaching books that are out there as well that are quite helpful.